Video games are more accessible today than ever before thanks to the combination of physical and digital games, and you also have things like blogs, YouTube channels, and podcasts that can help promote those games that otherwise would not get a lot of TLC. People would just not know about that because think about the way that we grew up in the 90s and even early 2000s. A lot of times our source for information were video game magazines like Game Informer, Game Pro, EGM, and things like that. So unless a game came out in a magazine and you heard about it, or a friend went to Blockbuster and told you, hey, you got to check this game out, you really did not have another source of information, which led to a lot of games just never being played by people like us, which led us to the conversation of, why don't we do a podcast episode that is dedicated to listing out and just talking about some incredible video games, or dare we say hidden gems or underrated games that we haven't played or completed, but we absolutely should. So we're going to be talking about that on another exciting episode of A Cast of the Past, which you can check out a brand new episode each and every Sunday. And my name is Juan Velas, and joining me, this is a two-man episode because Keith Poshik went off to space. He'll be back eventually. We have from Boston, Massachusetts, Mr. Ryan McNulty. And Ryan, I got a question for you, brother. When we talk about underrated games, what is that for you? What is the first requirement, I guess I should say, that pops into your head?
For me, I would say the first requirement would be that it's not an often talked about game when you're talking about favorite games. Just the general public, looking on things like Reddit and other kind of discussions, or even just talking to your friends or everyday people. When you're talking about games, it's something that maybe doesn't come up as often as it should, whether you've played it or not. But obviously, everyone kind of has those games where they're like, oh, I played this game. Everyone I talk to has never played it before, but it's so good. You got to try it out. So I would say that would be kind of my definition of underrated.
I agree, because even working on this episode, it was challenging because video games, just everybody talks about that. Like you want to play an underrated game, just go to Google and there are like 50 articles. But that wasn't really the case in like 2004, 2005. I remember a lot of games that I would play. Like the first example is Katamari Damacy, the very first one on PlayStation 2. Like now, we have a remaster that's available on the Switch, and I love it. I actually have a physical copy, and I love playing it. But I remember the very first time that I heard about it was on a video game magazine, and they were mentioning that the game was bombing hard because it came out, and it was apparently a video game that people didn't really think the North American audience will like. Because for those who don't know, this came out on PS2, and it is a game where you're a prince, a tiny prince that goes to planet Earth and other planets, and you literally roll things into a ball. And as you continue rolling them, it gets bigger and bigger, and eventually you can roll dogs, you can roll buildings, or you can roll bodies, like actual people that are walking around the world. And the graphics are purposely bad. And the story just, nothing about this makes sense. Like somebody was clearly hashtag 420 it while making this game. So I went to an EB Games, and the game must have had come out maybe like 4 or 5 months prior, but because nobody was buying it, it was $20 new. $20 brand new. And that was not a common thing, but even the person at EB Games had no idea what that game was. Like when I took it to the front desk, the person was like, what is that? Like, we have that? Yeah. So I actually ended up buying it. That was maybe my first experience with an underrated game, but with that one, I actually played. So is there any game that you're like, man, I've heard about this and it has a passionate community, but I just never got around to it?
So when I was in college, one of my roommates was big into a lot of underrated PS2 games and stuff from that era. And he introduced me to a lot of games like the Silent Hill series and things like that. But one game he talked about that I've never played, but I've heard so many good things about, is called Beyond Good and Evil. And that is it's on PS2, PC, Xbox, and GameCube. So it like literally came out for every platform in 2003. The synopsis is the story follows the adventures of Jade, an investigative reporter and martial artist who works with a resistance movement to reveal a planet-wide alien conspiracy. The player controls Jade and allies, solving puzzles, fighting enemies, and obtaining photographic evidence. So that's like literally the extent that I know of the game, aside from like seeing a few screenshots. But I've heard from a lot of people that it is an exceptional game.
I've played a little bit of it because I own it for the 360 because it's one of those games that got an HD remaster before, like the PS4 and the Xbox One. And maybe I played like an hour of it, so I really just can't sit here and talk about it a lot. But based on what I played, it's got a lot in common with actually like Ocarina of Time. It gave me some vibes, plus it's got some photography elements that I really liked. And it's got like it's light on the combat, but it's high on the comedy and the dialogue. And I think, yeah, it's something that we definitely should play. And I think that's the most challenging thing is that now, the next example is something that I know the three of us haven't played, and that's Psychonauts. Psychonauts came out, I believe it was in 2005. It came out for the original Xbox, a PlayStation 2. It's out pretty much on anything. I was looking up yesterday on the PlayStation 3 PSN store. It's $5 regular price. So
it's
this
on
game
Steam.
bombed. Yeah, it's on Steam. And this game bombed hard. I was reading up, this is Wikipedia, but there's a lot more information out there, that this game did not sell well with only about 100,000 retail units sold at the time of release, leading to severe financial loss. So this game by Double Fine, you talk about Double Fine now, and they're Triple Fine because they release some exceptionally awesome games. But yeah, Ryan mentioned the synopsis for the other game, so with this one, Psychonauts follows the player character Raz, a young boy gifted with psychic abilities who runs away from the circus to try to sneak into a summer camp for those with similar powers to become a psychonaut, a spy with psychic abilities. I mean, a spy with psychic abilities. That sounds pretty badass, right?
It's not your definitely not your typical video game plot. It's a very creative concept.
And I think that a game like this, with modern gaming, I think with the rise of games like Super Mario Odyssey, there's a resurgence of platformers and action-adventure games that Psychonauts 2, thankfully, isn't going to come out. But I remember for years and years, people were talking about the fact that, are we going to get another one eventually? And we're getting that now, but it's thanks to the fact that passionate communities have kept these topics alive, right? Like they've kept talking about these games on forums and especially YouTube channels. How many YouTube channels do retrospective dedicated to underrated games? And I think that's just something that's great. Quick example, something I want to bring up that I have played, but others really should, is a Power Stone. Power Stone, if you play Super Smash Brothers, dare I say that Power Stone has more potential. And considering the fact that Capcom loves to re-release everything, I'm surprised they haven't. This was a 3D fighting game.
Yeah, I played Power Stone 2 actually for the Dreamcast. It is basically a Smash Brothers, and they were actually very creative with a lot of the level designs, where sometimes it was almost like Mario Party-esque, and sometimes where you're like running through and there's something chasing you, but then it kind of goes back to just fighting game style. I had a lot of fun with it.
It was really, really good, man. And something that I was reading, and because I wanted to make sure I brought out something that most people probably haven't played, so I looked up underrated Game Boy Advance games, because I feel that it's really easy for us to talk about consoles, but the Game Boy Advance is perhaps my favorite handheld of all time, if not console, because you had games from Super Nintendo or dumbed down PS1 games, and apparently a game that came out at every list that I read was Dragon Ball Advanced Adventure. So this is not Dragon Ball The Legacy of Goku, which I believe the last game that came out for that was a Boo's Fury, but those were more like traditional RPG, like adventure games. This is actually a side-scrolling beat-em-up with fighting game mechanics based on Dragon Ball. Not Dragon Ball Z, but people say like unlike other games, this one's actually good. And that to me is something good, because have you ever heard about Dragon Ball Advanced Adventure? Did you once hear about that?
I probably looked at it back when I was trying to play a bunch of the DBZ games. There was a time where I was super into a lot of those, and I tried out the Legacy of Goku games, but probably because I wanted to get my Dragon Ball Z fix, I probably skipped the Dragon Ball game when I probably should have played it, because it's probably better.
Yeah, and the good thing is with that one, I was seeing the How Long to Beat. How Long to Beat, for those who don't know, is an incredible website that You go there, howlongtobeat.com, you write the name of the game, and it tells you the average beat time. So this one was only like 3.5 hours. So it's like, if you want to get your Dragon Ball fix, just pop this in maybe. I'm probably, even if we don't cover it for the channel eventually, I'm considering getting it just to check it out. But is there any other game that you know you haven't played and you feel kind of bad at the fact that you haven't done so?
Games I haven't played that I know I probably should.
I have one that you probably should, and I don't know if you have.
Let's hear.
I'm gonna throw it out
hear.
there. Okami.
Okay, so that is a game. It's on that back shelf. I started it. I started Okami.
When you say started it, did you get to the menu?
Yes. No, I got to what I think is maybe the turning point of the game, where it's like you're supposed to be confronting the main bad guy, but I know that's not the end of the game. So I got a decent chunk of the way through, and then I just fell off of it. So I'd have to start completely over.
Okay, so even though Keith isn't here, he's here in spirit. So he actually wrote out a list of 3 games. So let's do... I'll start, then Ryan back and forth, and we can talk about these games because the first one, you and Keith got into a bit of a debate just at the fact that he put that in here. So I feel like I'm going to do it just because you can't handle your emotions with this one, Ryan. Because the first one he wrote that he never played is any of the Silent Hill franchise. And for context, we do have an episode about the original Resident Evil 2, which Keith, I mean, he's an expert at that game, yet he never played Silent Hill. So he wrote, if you played survival horror games, you fell into one of the 2 camps, Capcom or Konami. I was a Capcom kid, so I chose games like Resident Evil and Dino Crisis over Silent Hill games. If I had to choose one game that I always wanted to try, it's Silent Hill Shattered Memories for the Wii. And I guarantee you that everybody listening is going, what? Because they were probably thinking like Silent Hill 2. I've always heard that game... I have always heard that this game did psychological horror right. And now, I'm just going to stop talking, and Ryan gets to react.
Well, I'll say this. I think Shattered Memories is probably one of the better Silent Hill games that came out after 3. The original trilogy is the strongest of all the games, and it only went downhill from there. But I thought Shattered Memories was a nice addition to the series. It's a reimagining of the first Silent Hill, but is very different in a lot of ways. My gripe with it is the whole where he says it's psychological horror, right? They go a little bit too literal with the psychological, as in you literally have a psychologist evaluating you in the game. But then also I think probably the one thing that kind of ruins the game is that when the bad guys only show up when basically the place goes to ice. So like you'll be in a room and all of a sudden it turns to ice and then there's bad guys. So there's really not a lot of tension when you're not in like the ice world basically. So that's the one thing. It's like, oh, if I go in this room, there's no ice, like I'm safe. So it kills a little bit of the tension. Other than that, though, I think it's a pretty good game.
Interesting. So I really have very little knowledge about Silent Hill, and I know that we're probably going to cover one this year.
We're covering it.
Rest assured,
we will be.
It's going to happen. The leading up, the build-up is real. But Ryan, present Keith's second game that I was incredibly surprised at the fact that he never played. And for context, I never played it. What about you? Which is Parasite Eve, by the way.
Parasite. Okay. So, yeah, I'll read what Keith said first. He said, my entire life I've managed to learn nothing about this game beyond the fact that I have friends that swear by it. Very high on my shame list of games I've never played. All I know is that it's a JRPG, and I think there's a camera involved. So if Parasite Eve is the game that I'm thinking of, I remember maybe that it was either the PS demo disc I had or whatever. There was like a trailer for it. And I was like, oh my God, this game is like super spooky looking. Like it like freaked me out. So it would definitely be something I'd love to play too, just to finally kind of confront that game, because I think there's some like creepy scene in like an opera house or something. And I just remember seeing that in the trailer. and it would be nice to be like actually see what this game is all about.
Yeah, because I don't know too much about it. It reminds me a lot of Resident Evil, the first one, and the second, like the gameplay style, because I think it has tank controls, but don't quote me on that. But I actually tried playing it because when I went up to the PS2 generation, I remember I went to a GameStop once and they had it because I think it had like 2 discs, like the Final Fantasy boxes that were a little bit on the thicker side. This one was like that as well. But when I brought it home, the first disc didn't work, so I just returned it. They didn't have another copy, so I never got a chance to play it. But I think that's one of the games that I always saw the box art when I went to Blockbuster and when I went to the stores, but nobody that I knew talked about it. And it wasn't until years later that I know that there was a sequel, but I also saw people talk about the fact that I think there's like a new one coming up, but people hate how it looks. But yeah, like I said, it's not my strong point. And Keith actually brought up a third game here, which I was surprised to see it brought up, not because of whether it's a good game or not, just not a genre we really play, which is Midnight Club 3. We've talked about Grand Theft Auto 3. Here's another Rockstar game. But Keith wrote, and I quote, my friends, in a time, he wrote it like a trailer, I guess, in a time when there was a lot of driving games coming out, Rockstar's take on the genre was one of my favorites. It was a more simple take, but a ton of fun in my books. Keith reads books. I would like to cover it one day. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. I think people talked about the soundtrack. I know there was like a dub edition, and there were other ones. I think maybe I rented the first one. What did you think about racing games as a whole, especially in the PS2 generation?
I never really got into them aside from things like Mario Kart, a lot of the party game racing stuff. Other than that, it's like I'll play it at a friend's house, but most of the time racing games kind of bore me, but I definitely would be interested to see a Rockstar game kind of take on a racing game to see how they separated themselves.
Yeah, I agree, man. And I think that one of the biggest purposes for the podcast, and even this episode, even before we hit the record button, because Keith is not in space, people, he just wasn't feeling a little great. So we had like a sit down meeting between the three of us, and we realized that every couple of months, the same way we do the off the rail episodes, which is we just kind of shoot the breeze and talk about random things. We want to be clear about, hey, these are games that are probably awesome. We have no doubt about that, but we just never played it because when you're a kid, you're flat broke. So even if you heard about this quote-unquote underrated game, maybe you just didn't have the money, right, to actually buy it. And then when you had the money, maybe that game's no longer available. Like, thankfully, now, even going as far back to the Resident Evil 2 episode, I know that's not a hidden gem, but you had never played it, but you bought it on PSN, right?
Yeah, I bought it off the PS3 store is still up and running, folks. So I don't even have a PS4 yet. So that's how behind the times I am. But the PS3 store, luckily, it's still open. I was able to get it. Yeah, with a lot of digital releases and just things like eBay, it's not that hard to find most games, unless you're looking for something that happens to be particularly rare and very expensive.
I remember you mentioned that, and the first game that pops into my head is Suikoden 2, which I believe you can now buy digitally. But that game, I always heard about it, and I don't know if... Well, yeah, I guess it was technically a hidden gem because you heard about it from like the JRPG community, right? And you had to really be passionate about it. I go to GameStop, and it was like $70 used. And like,
it's like Earthbound,
that's not happening.
Forever Earthbound was super rare and hard to get. I'm sure the cartridges are still expensive, but Nintendo has come out with digital releases,
If you think about it, is Earthbound maybe the first like real underrated game? Because when you bring it up to the masses, people still have no idea what we're talking about.
If it wasn't for Super Smash Brothers.
Yeah,
if it wasn't
there's this
for
character
Smash.
called Ness. He had a video game. He was in a thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know what F-Zero was until Smash Brothers either.
So, did you ever play Earthbound though?
Not more than maybe 10 seconds.
Okay, what did you do?
Not literally. I played the very, very beginning, never got very far, didn't know what the hell to do, gave up on it.
So are there any other games that you're just sitting here going, man, I just never got around to playing something
Oh, there's a billion. I just wouldn't consider most of them underrated. There's a lot of just games on my list that it's like, are you kidding me? You still haven't played that?
It's just so hard to. I feel like up until maybe like 2010, it would have been easier to call a game underrated, but because everybody's just talking about it, I remember.
Yeah, the gaming community is so expanded, and there's so many different niches. It's like you can really find a group of people who are into any series whatsoever. So, yeah, that's kind of how. Even though the internet is just, it's, the communities have just expanded across the world. So you'll find you can think of the most random game ever, and I'm sure there's a community for it. Except for Gain Ground, for some reason, that game that I love, that's on every Sega collection. It's still hard to find people talking about that game, but it's so underrated.
I have the PS4 collection, and I was looking at the Sega one, and I remember it last night.
We're gonna cover it someday. Don't you worry about that.
We got to do like a small Sega showcase or something.
Yeah.
But I think that for everybody watching and listening, the key part is look at your video game collection, whether it's physical or digital. And I know that through the lens of 2019, it's hard to say, well, this game isn't underrated because my favorite YouTube channel talked about it. Think about the fact that we are part of a niche, and there are niches within niches, right? Or there's like these, like just these segregated groups of people that, of course, are going to be talking about that. But when you go to the masses, or even back in the day, think of how many games, like Dark Cloud 2 is an example of a game that I've never played, but I always saw the box art. It was always there.
One of my friends would love that game.
Yeah, and I've heard nothing but great things. Is that the one with like
farming and stuff in it?
Yeah,
or
I believe it. I believe it's there. It's actually on the PS2 to PS4 service, which Sony is terrible because on the PS3 you can actually buy a couple of PlayStation 2 classics, but they're not upscale. But on the PS4 they are. So Sony, just the moral of the story is this: make the old games accessible, please, so we can actually play them, and we don't have to look through illegal means of acquiring these different video games. But Ryan, we're not done, because we have a list here at the bottom of our Google Drive document, and I think that everybody, you're going to enjoy this, because this episode has a purpose. It wasn't just to talk about, these random games that we've never played. We want this to lead up to a full-length episode where we review one of these games. So 3 out of the 4 options we've already talked about. The fourth one we added literally minutes before we hit the record button, because we all kind of went like, hey, yeah, we've heard about that but haven't played it. So, Mr. McNulty, could you present the 4 options?
All right, so for the 4 options that we are leaving it up to the audience to vote for what we will play down the line. Option 1, we have Psychonauts. Option 2, Katamari Damacy. Option 3, Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver. And then finally, option 4, Midnight Club 3.
Yeah, so that option Keith fought to the end to make sure we could add it. And it makes sense, because we mentioned it all the way back in our pilot episode. We're eventually going to get to video game genres that we don't necessarily love, but give them a shot, right? Give them a shot, because...
Yeah, it's all about... I mean, especially this poll in particular, it's all about getting to things that we've never got around to covering, or things we might not otherwise play if it wasn't for this podcast. I don't think I ever would play Midnight Club 3 unless it was presented in this format, and maybe I'll like it a lot more than I thought.
Exactly.
Or, the same for Katamari, or the same for Soul Reavers, so you never know.
Yeah, so if you guys want to vote, you go to twitter.com/acasttothepast. And this episode comes out on a Sunday, so on the Monday afterwards, we're going to be leaving this for an entire week. So if you're listening to this because you're backlogging A Cast to the Past, sorry, poll probably closed a couple of months ago. But yeah, twitter.com/acasttothepast. You can help us vote. And yeah, all 4 options I'm excited to play, because I love those generations. PS1, PS2, that's my jam. That's what I'm really playing, even just in my casual day-to-day basis. But if you guys want to enjoy some more episodes of A Cast of the Past, we have one dedicated to some of our favorite Super Nintendo games, popular games we've never played. So we kind of went through the other side of the fence, right? We did one talking about your Half-Life, your The Witcher. So if you want to hear that list, you can actually check it out right now on the YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/acastofthepast. And if you listen to us on podcast apps, please help us out. Ryan, put sound sad. Can you sound sad without talking?
Oh, without talking. I was going to talk to whatever. I'm going to talk. Please, sir, leave a 5-star review. Please. Come on, can you do that? Why did you randomly get an accent, though? Does that just make it sadder? Oliver Twist, like, please, sir, I want some more, you know.
But we talk about the Resident Evil 2 remake, the original Resident Evil 2. We talked about Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2. Why so many 2s, actually, now that I'm looking at the list?
You know, a lot of sequels are the better game because first one's a great idea, and then the second one improves on all the stuff. You know, it's like the opposite of movies. The twos,
yeah, that's true.
Video game sequels do a lot better than movie sequels.
They do.
On average.
Yeah, I was gonna say there's an asterisk there, but if you guys just want to come chat with us, go over to acastofthepast.com/discord. We can carry the conversation about underrated games that we've never played, but probably should. And we'll definitely be talking about all of this in another exciting edition of A Cast to the Past.
Tried to do the Keith version.
Yeah.
I can't do it like him.
Keith, come back.